This was a meetup event on April 23rd, hosted by Agnostic Agile, with speaker Roman Pichler on dealing with difficult stakeholders.
Tonight, that is, here in the UK and I guess in Western Europe. So nice to see so many people and so many people from different continents joining in. So dealing with difficult stakeholders. Now, whenever I deal with somebody who I find difficult, maybe because I disagree with the views of the individual, or I find the person not particularly likable, then there's an element of friction, of disagreement and conflict. Now, conflict is completely natural. It routinely occurs at work and it routinely occurs at home. It just simply means there's a clash of interests. So why is conflict and why is dealing with difficult people particularly relevant for product people in product management, for agile product owners? But I think the reason is due to the nature of the role of a product person, a product owner or product manager. So as product people, we have to interact with a number of different groups, and those groups can have conflicting interests, perspectives, and in some cases needs. So they're the customers and the users, and depending on the size of the product and how large it is and how large the market is that it serves and how heterogeneous that market is, the users may have different needs compared to the customers. They may have different perspectives, they may have different ideas. And then product people have to interact with business stakeholders. So for a commercial product, that be somebody from marketing and sales, support, maybe finance or operations. And these individuals come from different business units, from different departments, and that makes it likely that they have different views, different interests or goals. So there may be an element of friction there as well. And then finally, product people interact with one or more agile development teams. Those teams are cross-functional, so people have different skills, different areas of speciality. And again, that can lead to a certain amount of disagreement. So product person is right at the center there, trying to interact with all those different groups and individuals. And again, I think that explains why product people tend to experience quite a bit of friction, quite a bit of conflict. Now, we may not like conflict, but it can actually be a source of creativity and innovation if we manage to address it constructively. And it can help us learn more about the people we interact with, and it can help us learn more about ourselves. So it can strengthen the connections that we have, say, to the business stakeholders. Unfortunately, we don't always manage to navigate conflict constructively. And I've seen on more than one occasion at work instances where conflict wasn't dealt with particularly well. So the four, before I get to them, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I talk about common ways of how we tend to address conflict that aren't necessarily always helpful, let me share you an example of a scenario that contains an element of disagreement and dispute. So the scenario is based on the assumption that a senior stakeholder, Sophie, comes to the desk of a product person, product owner, product manager, and we're playing the role of the product person. So listen, I really need you to add this feature to the release, and I'm not going to take no for an answer, says Sophie. And she's the head of sales, and she stands in front of your desk. You can feel your shoulders tensing and your stomach tightening. There is no way that you can add more work to the development effort. The dev team is already struggling with the current workload. But Sophie is a powerful senior manager who will not be afraid to escalate the issue. What should you do? So you're likely to have different reactions to this scenario, but it's quite common to employ one of the four unfortunately unhelpful conflict strategies. And I use a classification that was suggested by a gentleman called Oren J. Sofer in his book, Say What You Mean. So the first strategy that we could employ here in this conflict with Sophie is called competitive confrontation. And that basically means seeking open conflict, or being prepared to enter the conflict in an open fashion, and standing up to Sophie and saying, no, I'm not going to do this. There's no way that we can add more work to the development effort, as you well know. And who are you anyway? You come here to my desk, you make demands, you interrupt my work. I'm not going to have this. And so the assumption is that I'm right and Sophie is wrong. And it's Sophie's fault. She's the one to blame. She brought about the issue, the conflict, and I have to protect my needs. I'll have to stand up and fight, otherwise I'll lose out. And any understanding, any empathy I'll show will be seen as vulnerability and used against me. So if saying no to Sophie and engaging in open conflict is a smart strategy, given that she's a senior stakeholder, well, I'll let you decide this. But it's certainly an option I've seen product people take. Another option that is still based on the idea that we're trying to win, but this time in a more indirect way, it would be passive aggression. So being passive aggressive means engaging in a sort of guerrilla warfare in a way. And giving Sophie a hard time and being very difficult to work with. So I could say, well, Sophie, you're asking for a lot there, and I'm sure you know how difficult it is, that request with this feature. I'm not sure, I can't commit right now. I can promise we'll put it on the product backlog. I'll have to go to the development team and talk to them and then get back to you. It's going to be very, very difficult. We'll try our best, but it's extremely challenging. It'll be extremely challenging. And then, I could go to the development team and say, guys, guess what? Sophie just came, and you know what? She demanded that we're going to implement this feature. I had to promise her to put it on the product backlog, but don't worry. I'll deprioritize it. I'll put it right at the bottom. We'll never get to it. And then maybe go and talk badly about Sophie to other product people, and say, like, guess what? Has she done that to you as well? Oh my God, that woman! Oh, she's outrageous! Oh my God! So we're still coming from a place where I feel I'm right and Sophie is wrong, and I'm still trying to win here, but again, in a much more indirect way than in the first option. The next two strategies are less about winning, and they're more about mitigating our losses. And so the third one here is called conflict avoidance. Now, an example in my mind, in the context of the scenario that I shared with you earlier, would be to say, is this such a big deal? Do we have to make a drama out of this? Can't we be sensible? Can't we act like grown-ups? Can't we be reasonable about this? Sophie's a senior stakeholder, and usually she's a reasonable enough person. There must be a good reason why she requests that feature, why this is so important to her. I'm sure we can go and find out. But let's be helpful. Let's have a can-do attitude, and let's do as much as we can. So why don't we split the difference? Why don't we agree on a compromise? So it'll be impossible to implement the feature completely now, but we can offer that we implement maybe half of it, and then the other part we'll implement in a subsequent release. It'll be a little bit tough, selling that to the development team, but they may understand, and hopefully we can make this work. So yeah, let's go for it. So some of you may think, yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, let's do this. But the trouble with this strategy is that, in my mind, it doesn't attach, or it doesn't really address, I should say, the underlying causes, the real issue here. So it stays at the surface and it focuses on the feature. But then, when we reflect on Sophie's behavior, what she's doing, she's treating the product person in this scenario, in this story, like a personal assistant. She goes to the desk of the individual and she requests or even demands that this feature be implemented. And so I think she's not really showing respect to the role of a product person, a product owner, a product manager. She doesn't really treat the individual as an empowered product owner or product manager, and doesn't really show much respect in my mind. So I don't think that's right. And I also think that she doesn't show respect to the established product management processes. So I would expect that there is a way how requests for new features are being assessed in a collaborative manner, certainly in an agile context, maybe something like a strategy or product roadmap workshop, difficult word, product roadmap workshop, where the product person and the stakeholders and some of the development team members regularly come together and discuss changes to the strategy and the product roadmap, and debate desirable outcomes and what needs to be done to achieve them, and which features should be implemented and which shouldn't. So I'd expect that Sophie shows up at those workshops, at those meetings, or maybe more appropriately sends a member of her staff to attend as the sales rep. But what she's really doing here is she's trying to expedite, to push through her specific feature. And again, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's helpful or appropriate behavior. So if we now try and strike a deal and agree on a compromise, we ultimately let Sophie get away with, well, the behavior that she's showing. And what prevents her from copying that behavior and acting in similar ways in the future, and other stakeholders from copying this behavior? So I don't think that's a helpful strategy either. And then the final strategy is referred to as passivity. And that would mean to say, what can I do? It's not much, really. I mean, Sophie, she's so much more powerful than me. If I say no, it's no point, because she'll go to my boss and the boss will come to me and says, you got to do it. So I might as well say yes, not now, and just just kind of bite the bullet. It'll be tough. I'll have to try and sort of sell it to the development team. Maybe I can entice them to work a little bit longer, buy them pizza, alcohol-free beer, and vanilla ice cream, or something along those lines. But yeah, I don't have any choice. But that of course means that I'd give up my needs, and it again would mean that I kind of showing submissive behavior, and that I indirectly approve of the way Sophie's acted, which again I don't think would be helpful, wouldn't be appropriate. So all these four conflict strategies are quite common. I've certainly seen them being used, but again, unfortunately, they're not very helpful, and they typically leave behind a trail of bruised feelings and of mistrust. So if these strategies aren't really helpful to address the conflict properly and resolve it, then what can we do? Well, a similar challenge dealing with difficult people was encountered by the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States, but admittedly in a much more extreme context. So they were faced with armed terrorists capturing US citizens and asking for ransom, threatening that they would kill the hostages if their demands are not fulfilled. Now, if you grew up in the 1980s like me with Hollywood movies, you might be tempted to suggest sending in a Rambo-like agent who can single-handedly free the hostages and capture the baddies. And it turns out that apparently the FBI have tried this approach, but in the real world, it has a low success but a high death rate. So what they've developed is an alternative model, a different approach, and this model is also referred to as the behavioral change Stairway model. And that's something I'd like to share with you. So the idea is, no matter if we deal with an armed terrorist or Sophie, a senior difficult stakeholder, the idea is that we'd like to encourage a positive behavior change. So we'd like Sophie to understand that the way she's acted and maybe the way she's spoken isn't helpful, it isn't appropriate. And we'd like her to understand that it isn't possible just to add, and maybe not even desirable, in order to maximize the value that the product creates. So it's not possible, and it may not be desirable to add this feature to the current release, to the current development effort. And then, of course, the question is, well, how can we encourage behavior change, given that Sophie is more senior, she's more powerful, and as the person in charge of the product, you typically don't hold what's referred to as transactional power. So that means being able to tell people what to do, or at least offering some incentives like a bonus or a pay rise. So we don't have that at our disposal. So the only other option then we have is to influence her. So to encourage her to listen to what we have to say, to our perspective, to our view, and open up to our needs. Now, how do we get Sophie to do this? How do we get her to respect our perspective and our needs? Well, the key is to build trust, to build a trustful relationship, rapport with her. And so, if we already know Sophie and maybe we've worked with her in the past, then to strengthen the connection we have. If we haven't worked with Sophie or not particularly successful in the past, then to build that connection. And because only when Sophie trusts us, if she trusts us, will she be willing to listen to us, and she will be interested in our perspective and needs, and be willing to follow our suggestions and advice. So, of course, then, the question is, how do we build trust? And one of the key mechanisms to build trust and a key element, key step here in the behavioral change Stairway model is empathy. So empathy really means trying to understand Sophie and trying to understand where she's coming from, what's happening for her, what's going on for her in terms of the emotion that she's experiencing, but also her underlying needs and goals and interests. It means reaching out with warm-heartedness, no matter how difficult we may find Sophie, no matter how much we might disagree with what she has to say. So it essentially means accepting her as she is right now. And the important point here for me to stress is that acceptance doesn't mean approval. It doesn't mean agreement. It doesn't mean that we agree with the way Sophie's spoken and acted. It just means that we acknowledge it, and we fully acknowledge it, and that we try not to respond or react with a form of aversion or aggression or frustration, but that we try and reach out to her with interest, with genuine interest and an element of warm-heartedness. Now, how do we do this? How do we build empathy? How do we cultivate, strengthen empathy? By actively listening to somebody, in this case to Sophie, by making a real effort not only to hear what she says, but really build that understanding. So this is the behavioral change Stairway model. It's really a sequence of steps. Those steps can't be skipped, and you can't try and rush them. So building empathy and particularly building trust can take time. But these are necessary prerequisites for then being able to influence somebody like Sophie. And of course, this is a model that doesn't guarantee success. Given the options that we have, I think it offers a viable path, but it doesn't mean if you follow these steps that Sophie will actually change her behavior for the better. So as active listening, listening deeply to Sophie, to a difficult person, plays an important part in this model. I thought I'd share a few tips around listening. And I think generally for product people, it's worthwhile to reflect on our listening skills and trying to develop and increase them. There's so much interacting we have to do with others, and so much we can benefit from listening to others, not only to users and customers, but also to stakeholders and development team members, that I think it's again worthwhile to strengthen our listening skills. The first tip is to be fully present and listen attentively. Now I find that's easier said than done. So I can be quite restless and stressed, and I can make the mistake of rushing from one meeting to the next. My mind can be full of thoughts, and sometimes I don't really listen to understand. I don't really listen attentively. I listen to respond, and I start formulating an answer in my head while the person is speaking. But the idea of attentive listening is really leading with your presence and really giving the person your full attention. And that makes somebody feel valued and understood. I think we notice as human beings if somebody is really listening, or somebody is half pretending or partially listening. And so in order to be able to attentively listening, I would suggest that you schedule some time between meetings, particularly if these are important meetings with important or difficult conversations, and that you take time after a meeting to digest what happened and before a meeting to get ready. So avoid rushing from one meeting to the next. And then secondly, make sure that you're in the right state of mind to have a difficult conversation and listen attentively. So for instance, when assuming that Sophie comes to me, she comes to my desk and she demands that feature, and my response might be irritation, it might be frustration, it might be anger, it might be worries or concerns, maybe an element of anxiety, and there may be a combination. then I may not be in the right state of mind to talk to her immediately. And it might be best to say, Sophie, this is really important to me, and I'd really like to have a proper conversation with you about this, but I'm feeling a little bit worked up right now. Can we please talk later this afternoon or tomorrow, or whenever it's a good time? Yeah, so don't feel don't feel rushed, or don't feel kind of forced to sort out an issue immediately. Sometimes pausing and sometimes reflecting and giving yourself some time to digest what you've perceived and what you're feeling is the right thing to do. The next listening tip is to be respectfully curious, suspend judgment, and cultivate an open mind. So there's a great guideline in product management when it comes to working with data, and that is to separate the data collection from the data analysis. And the idea is that by separating those two steps, we can be more objective. We can be more objective when we analyze or evaluate the data, and then we stand a better chance of drawing the right conclusions. Now, I find when I listen to somebody, particularly if that's a difficult person, it's a difficult conversation, as the individual is talking, my mind is going off and starting to evaluate and saying, but that's wrong because, and this is wrong because, and she or he is there wrong again because. And of course, that then distracts me. It takes me away from being fully present. But even more so, it can give rise to a very critical attitude and a sort of nearly aversive attitude towards the individual. And so that makes it very difficult then to cultivate empathy and really reach out with warm-heartedness. So the idea is, no matter how much you disagree with what the person has to say, that you still take an interest at what the individual says. And you're kind of grateful in this case that Sophie made an effort and showed up. She must have an interest in the product, and I mean that's something at least to sort of find positive, I think. Yeah. And sometimes when you deal with somebody who you find really difficult, then reflecting on the positive qualities of the individual can help you. So maybe Sophie can be a very caring person to the members of her staff, and maybe reflecting on that helps you cultivate an openness, an open mind, and suspend judgment. So my suggestion would be try and listen attentively without judging, without evaluating. Then pause, let what you've heard sink in, and then think about how you want to respond, and then say what you have to say. And then the last listening tip is listen not only for what is being said, for the facts, but also listen for the emotions, the feelings that go with it, and the underlying needs. So feelings often expressed through the body language, our body language, and that includes things like facial expressions and how loudly somebody speaks, and also the choice of words to a certain extent. So if Sophie comes to my desk and she's got a red face and she talks rather loudly, then the likelihood is that she's upset. And I think that's important to notice, and it may provide a clue to her needs. Why requesting that feature and how getting that feature implemented is so important to her. And then another way you can dig down and find out what's really going on for Sophie, why she's making this effort and showing up at the desk, is to ask open questions, questions that typically start with why, how, or what. So I could say, Sophie, please help me understand why is that feature so important to you, and why is it so important to you to have it implemented right now? And that way better understand her interests and underlying needs. So those are 3 listening tips. There are a few more tips I wanted to share with you around building trust. Empathy, as I said earlier, is a key trust building measure. It helps others to trust us when they see that we are open and reach out with interest and warm-heartedness to them, and acceptance. But there's more that you can do. The first tip here is, or the first technique is, to speak and act with integrity. So say what you believe is true, and then walk your own talk. And I think that's sounds like a pretty trivial piece of advice. But I think when we reflect on how hard or easy it is to be truthful and show integrity at the workplace, then certainly my perception is different. And I remember I was working a few years back on a new important new product development efforts. We were building a brand new product, and it wasn't going too well. And the big boss, my boss, he was getting more and more irritated and concerned. And he could be a very friendly and warm-hearted person, but he could also get pretty grumpy and pretty arsy. And he was getting grumpier and grumpier. And so what we started doing in the meetings with him is we started to sugarcoat messages. And I would say, yeah, that data doesn't look good, but there's some positive news as well. And really, I don't think it's going to be that bad. It's just at the moment, we'll get through this. And so, I was starting to fabricate little white lies. And, while that may not have been such a big deal, I didn't certainly speak truthfully. And maybe more importantly in this context of what it led to is indirectly supporting my boss's behavior and letting him get away with responding with a negative attitude towards people showing him data, and data that showed that the development effort wasn't going as well as we'd all hoped for. So applying this technique means that you have to be willing to be courageous and sometimes say things and act in ways that isn't necessarily easy and straightforward. The next technique is to get to know people and allow people to get to know you. So I think we're all influenced by our backgrounds and family situations and interests, and sharing the information can help us better understand why people behave in certain ways and why they have certain perspectives and ideas, why certain things are important to them. And it might help us then better contextualize Sophie's behavior. I remember a while back I was in a meeting, and it was a very difficult meeting. And one of the individuals who I know as a very nice and reasonable person kept hijacking the meeting and going off on tangents. And I really didn't quite know how to react and how to respond to this. And so I was getting increasingly irritated and a bit frustrated. And I found out only after the meeting that at this stage she was still going through her divorce and through a particularly difficult part of her divorce. And I think that really contributed to this behavior. And if I'd known this beforehand, it would have been much easier for me to deal with it, and I might have been able to say something more helpful or constructive. So again, shows that it can be very useful to understand where people are coming from when we get to know people. Maybe also take a little bit of time before a meeting to check in and see how people are. A technique that was suggested by Patrick Lencioni in his book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, is to share failure stories in order to build trust and get to know people. That can be pretty powerful, because when you share a true failure story, then you show vulnerability, and that allows you to earn the trust of the listeners. But if you apply this technique, then I would suggest that you take the lead and you start by sharing one of your failure stories. I'm sure we all have some to share. And then involve people in product decisions, encourage them to share their ideas, but also their concerns. Involving people in product decisions shows them that you value their opinion, that you're interested in their perspective. But it doesn't mean that you necessarily do everything that people suggest, or you try and please everyone. I think that'd be the opposite of effective collaborative decision-making. It means that you attentively and openly listen to the individuals and try and understand where they're coming from, what their needs are, and then do your best to find a solution that moves the product forward in the right way and is as sustainable as possible for the group present. And then be supportive and offer help wherever possible and appropriate. But of course, don't neglect your core responsibilities, and don't sacrifice sustainable pace and your mental well-being. So an area where I see product people lending and helping hands fairly commonly really is when it comes to the Scrum Master and or the work of an Agile coach. So many product people I work with don't have Scrum Masters and Agile coaches who are sufficiently available and adequately qualified. And then it's very tempting for the product person to step in and take on some of those responsibilities. But being a product owner, product manager is already a demanding job as it is. It's very multifaceted. There's a lot to it. And then taking on additional responsibilities makes it even more difficult. So I would encourage those of you who work as product people, don't do it. Look at the underlying causes and accept the issue as an organizational impediment. Look into ways how you can resolve that impediment for good, rather than kind of making do with a Band-Aid type approach and trying to cover. Even though that's sometimes admittedly easier said than done. And finally, strengthen your own product management expertise. So again, for those of you who work as product people, it's difficult for others to trust us and to follow our advice if they, if they're concerned that our expertise may not be appropriate. And I remember talking to a product owner a little while back, and she was saying to me how she wished that her management was more appreciative of her wanting to take on the strategic responsibilities of her product and managing her product in its entirety, and allowing her to take charge of the product roadmap. And so we got talking, and after a little while, I asked her if she'd created a product roadmap before, or if she'd be confident to do it. And she looked at me surprised and said, like, no, why? And I know this is a bit of a chicken and egg problem, that it can be challenging to acquire a new skill if your management doesn't support you. But at the same time, there's so many great blog posts and videos and helpful books out about product road mapping that I think in this situation, it might have been better for her to maybe read up on some product road mapping techniques, and thereby showing to the stakeholders and her management that actually, she has got a good idea what she's talking about, and she's able to take the lead. That would have probably built some trust. So again, by increasing your expertise, you can encourage people to trust you and follow your advice. So to summarize, dealing with difficult people is, in my mind, part and parcel of being a product professional. So it comes with the job, if we like it or not. And I think it's at least as important as other product management work, like product road mapping and prioritizing the product backlog. And one of the mistakes I see product people make, one of the mistakes I've made myself in the past, is to say, yeah, this people stuff and this conflict management stuff and this relationship building stuff, I know it's important, but I've got so much other important work to do. In fact, that's much more important. I'll really need to reprioritize the product. I really, really, really need to write some more user stories. I really need to go and talk to the development team. I really need to look at the product roadmap. I'll do the people stuff when I have time. And I think that's a mistake, because the danger is we'll never address it then. And I think conflicts don't just go away, but unresolved conflicts, they tend to linger, and they affect us in a bad way. They can affect relationships and impact our mental well-being and reduce productivity. So I think it's worthwhile to consider addressing conflicts, particularly bigger conflicts and conflicts that have been going on for a little while that are reoccurring. Those are the ones that you may want to consider addressing first. And then learning to resolve conflict and building trust, I think, are important leadership skills for product people to acquire and develop. And they allow us to strengthen connections, improve the work environment, and grow as individuals and leaders. So those were my thoughts on dealing with difficult stakeholders. I hope you've found them a little bit useful. So thank you for listening. If you would like to find out more about my thoughts on product leadership, please check out my website. And I've recently published a new book called How to Lead in Product Management that talks more about stakeholder management, but also conflict resolution. So maybe helpful for some of you. And then I'm very much looking forward to your questions and answering your questions right now. But if you have a follow-up question, or if for whatever reason your question doesn't get answered, then don't be shy, and please reach out to me, preferably via email, and I'll respond as soon as I can. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roman. That was an incredible talk. Lots of insights. Normally we have a nice round of applause, but obviously that's a bit difficult. It would just be me. And I won't ask everyone to unmute to do that. So.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we continue. What I'll do is I'll read one of them. Before I do so, very kindly, Roman has offered to offered to give away his new book, How to Lead in Product Management, to one lucky attendee tonight. What we'll do is whoever asks a question, that's the book Roman is holding up, whoever asks a question, I'll choose randomly at the end of the Q&A session who will be the lucky person to receive the book. So if you ask a question, you have a chance to win, if that is not incentive enough. Okay, so the first question from Mehul. I think this was on the slide around trust. So what if the person is a consultant from a competition company and has a different way to approach things to impress the client? I guess this one might be around, trying to impress and outweigh the competition rather than maybe take a trustful approach.
And so the question is, what would be an appropriate way to respond?
Mehul, if you want to clarify, you can. Otherwise, I'd assume.
Can I ask the question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so considering a situation where the team, the product team, has got a product owner from a consultant company, and the development team is from another consultant company, and both are hired by a company which is outsourced everything. Okay, so product owner is the only one, and he wants to get some more people, and that is the agenda he has in the back of his mind, but he's not ever telling, but he is pushing hard to the development team to take more things and making as a hard time for the development team. So how do you approach those situations?
Yeah, nice question. Thank you for asking it. So in an ideal scenario, there would be a Scrum Master or Agile coach who can help and reminds the product owner that it's the job of the team to determine how much work can be done. So in Scrum, obviously, that's done in sprint planning. But in a Kanban environment, it'd be up to the team to determine the WIP limits on the board. And so, in both models, the idea is to create sustainable pace by empowering the people doing the work, the development team members, to say, this is how much work we can do. And again, in Scrum, this is how much work we can do in a sprint in a given period of time. And so if a product owner, if a product manager, a product person tries to push more work onto the development team as the individuals are comfortable to take on and feel they can realistically do, then the product owner or product manager is taking away empowerment from the team, and at the same time acting, I think, in unhelpful ways. So it'd be then really up to the Scrum Master, Agile coach to help the individual realize that and explain that, and maybe figure out why is that. Is it a lack of process understanding? Is the product person, the product owner in your example, too ambitious? Has she or he made commitments to or promises to the client that cannot be met? What's going on here? If there's no Scrum Master or product owner, then the development team, my suggestion would be the development team members think about the best way to help the product owner realize what's going on there. And, a good way to do it generally would be to have a joint retrospective. That's what certainly in Scrum sprint retrospectives are there for. So that'd be probably my suggestion. So where's the Scrum Master? If there's no Scrum Master, why is there no Scrum Master? And then the development team members should try and figure out how to best approach the product owner. If that's then done as a group effort, if one or two individuals go and talk to the product owner, if it's a group effort, then the sprint retrospective would be a great place to have that conversation. But you may have to prepare it a little bit, and you have to make sure that the product owner doesn't feel overwhelmed if it's a group conversation. And a guideline is to separate person and issue, and try not to attack in any way the product owner, but again, come from a place of empathy. So going back to what I said about influencing people and helping people change for the better. We don't do it. I sometimes make that mistake of telling people, you're wrong, and this is why you're wrong, and this is why your behavior is wrong, and this is what you should do differently. And then people never change. That's not how people typically change, but they typically change because they feel understood, they feel valued, they feel appreciated in one way or the other. So yeah, maybe a bit of empathy would help.
Great, interesting question and answer. I like the one about separating the person from the idea. Very useful. Thank you, Mehul. The next question we have is from Dilip Sahu. Do you want to ask the question yourself, or should I? It's quite straightforward.
Yep. So, hi, Roman. The thing is here, this is the real ground, what I'm facing it. So how do you deal with a product manager who is a crack and highly political? And this you can see most of the product organizations, or where the third-party vendors or the partners, what you call, work with them, and a manager deal with them.
So your challenge is you work with a product person who's highly political?
Yeah, he's a crack and highly political, both together.
Say that again, he's?
A crack.
And in the sense of, just to make sure that I understand correctly?
Yeah, in the sense is he doesn't have the roadmap. He doesn't come out with the vision.
Right.
And he always works on like illusions, and everything is an assumptions. But
Right.
he's a product owner, and he has a potential to deal with it, but he's highly political.
Oh, okay, I see. So there's the unrealistic expectations of wishful thinking. I mean, ultimately, I think it's not too dissimilar to the question we discussed earlier. I think ultimately here the issue is, or the challenge is, how can you help that product person, that product owner, to change for the better? Again, the best approach that I know is by coming from a place of curiosity and care, and taking an interest in what's going on for the individual, and why the individual is acting in such a way. Why is the individual being unrealistic? Why is the individual maybe over-promising or over-committing to others? What's going on here? And again, certainly in a Scrum setup, you'd expect that a Scrum Master would help address the issue. You may want to use a sprint retrospective to look into it. Generally, the idea, certainly in an Agile context, is that whoever's in charge of the product, the product owner, the product person, and the people building the solution, designing and building the solution, that there's close collaboration. Collaboration is, of course, only possible if there's a fair amount of trust.
Yep.
So yeah, try and find out what's going on. Why does the product person, why does the product owner, why is she or he attached to those ideas, and to wishful or unrealistic thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next one is from Santanu. Would you like to ask the question yourself?
Sure. Thank you. Roman, this is Shantanu. So you talked about conflict resolution between the product owner and some probably senior person in the company or a stakeholder. How do you address the conflict between two stakeholders, which is distracting your product management role, when mainly it appears into the prioritization issue or some other conflicts about the product features, when two stakeholders are having conflict? Right. As a third person, how he can handle that?
Yeah, interesting question. Thank you for asking it. So I think the two aspects to this. I mean, the first one is, how can you help other people who you see are locked in conflict? How can you help them? I mean, the first thing I'd like to say is, when there is conflict, and then don't ignore it. I said that earlier, but I thought it's worthwhile restating. That's also true when other people who you work with are locked in conflict. So don't just ignore it and hope it'll get better on its own if those individuals aren't seemingly able to constructively address the issue. But then how you help them, how you can help them, I think will depend on where you stand and how much conflict resolution skills you have. So if you're competent in using a model like the behavioral change Stairway model, or one of the models I also talk in my book is nonviolent communication. So if you're skilled in nonviolent communication, you can offer to the two parties, the two people in conflict, that you'll guide them through the process, or you can at least offer to teach them the model and the technique so they can then try and apply it. But then I think that only works if you're being seen as neutral and not biased in any form. Otherwise, if you feel that's not the case, then I would suggest that you look for a more neutral person, a mediator, possibly together with HR or the line managers of the individuals. So that's one thing. The other thing is stakeholders not being able to agree on a feature. That for me per se is not an issue, because I personally think that the individual who should have the last say on what the product should look like and do, and the value it should create and the key capabilities it should have, is the product owner, certainly in an Agile Scrum-based context. So while I think that product owners should seek the perspectives and ideas and concerns and understand the needs of development team members and stakeholders when it comes particularly to important product decisions, so high stake decisions or complex decisions, it's good to make those collaboratively. It doesn't mean that the stakeholders necessarily have to always agree. So there are various decision rules that you can use. One would be the product person decides after discussion, which means you first attentively listen to everyone. And again, you do some inquiry around why do people suggest A and why does somebody suggest B? And then you decide as the person in charge of the product. Or you could go for consent and say, like, okay, we'll sort of, decide by consent, which means as long as nobody has any meaningful objections, that means it's good enough. We'll go with it, and then we experiment. And by the way, particularly when it comes to features, sometimes experimentation is the best way forward. If you can't say if it should be feature A or B, then do a little bit of user research, whichever way that might take, a little bit of validation. And it could be that you push out some feature fakes and see, which one people respond to, and where you create more engagement.
Great.
Thank you, Roman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question we have is from Laura Morgan. Laura, would you like to ask your question?
No, you ask it. I'll get sidetracked. If it needs clarification, I'll wade in then.
Sure, no problem. So Laura's question is, do you have any suggestions on managing the potential conflict between product and marketing or another similar function around who owns the customer relationship?
Yeah, it's a nice question. Thank you. So with all the other conflict-related questions, I would suggest exploring what's at the root of this conflict. Why is it important for the different departments to own that relationship? And why is it important to the individuals involved in the issue, in the conflict? What's going on there? What's really going on there? Because at the end of the day, I'm sure what everybody, at least on paper, would probably agree to is that you want to maximize the value the product creates, for the customers and users and for your business. So why is the customer relationship such a crucial element in terms of, if you think of something like the business model and the business model canvas by Alexander Osterwalder, you'd sort of, have the customer relationship right in there and you'd describe it. So why is the ownership of that element so important to those departments? Why is that? And I think once you understand that, then you might be in a better position to say, okay, how can you then help them move on? I mean, my take on customer relationship is, and customer interaction generally, is that I think, I strongly feel, I strongly believe that product people should have direct access to customers and users on a regular basis. And so the rule of thumb that I like to suggest is that the product manager, product owner, somebody who works as a product person should be able to talk to users and customers, at least selected users and customers, at least once per quarter. And a part of that has to do with empathy, being able to really understand what's going on for the individuals. That may not be representative for the entire market and all customers, but I think it's very difficult to empathize with data. I haven't been able to do it. So I think we need to see and meet humans and listen to humans so we can build empathy. So if that's something in there, then maybe it's also around an understanding of what does product management mean and what does product ownership mean. And it's, for me, it's not about I own this, I own that, but how can we collaborate in such a way that, again, we maximize the benefits for the users and customers and for our business. And then why is that so difficult? What's the root cause here?
Amazing, thank you.
Great. Okay. Next, we're going to have Lana. Lana, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, good evening. So my question is, how better to, if you are a person who is in charge of the delivery, basically, and if your product manager always saying yes to stakeholders, and sometimes it's impede your delivery, you might have a lot of block tickets or abandoned work, or something like that. And I really would like to improve this, and what would be the best strategy here to deal with, to help them to agree on things.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for asking that question. I think it's probably something many other people can relate to. I've certainly seen product owners, do similar things as you just described. So before a product owner says, yeah, it's okay, we can do a piece of work, in my mind, a product owner should always go and talk to the development team and to make sure that the people who will actually then carry out the piece of work are confident that it can be done, at least within the time scales expected. So if your product owner is not doing this, and it sounds like it, then the question that I would have is, why is that? Is it that the relationship between the product owner and the development team isn't quite right, and the product owner doesn't trust the development team and doesn't trust the development team members to come up with realistic estimates, for instance? And I've seen this happen for various reasons. Sometimes because the development team members lack the skills, sometimes because the product owner had poor experiences working with development teams in the past, and then projected his or her experiences onto the team she or he was working with at the time. Or is it a wrong understanding of the product owner role? Is there a lack of empowerment for the product owner, that the product owner feels she or he can't say no to the stakeholders? So it's a little bit like the conflict strategies that I showed earlier around compromise, conflict avoidance, and passivity. And you just say like, yeah, okay, yes, stakeholder, and so you become a feature broker and a stakeholder pleaser. But that's of course not the job of a product owner. Saying no, hopefully in an understanding and empathic way, is part of the job. So again, is it a wrong understanding of the role? Is it a lack of empowerment? And then how can you help the individual? How can you support the individual? And I think you'll find out by empathizing with the product owner, even if that might be initially feel challenging. And again, a good possibility in an agile Scrum-based process would be to address the issue in a retrospective and try and talk openly but kindly about it, and have a skilled facilitator like a qualified Scrum Master there who can well moderate, facilitate the conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, there's one more thing that I wanted to say. The other thing that the development team can and sometimes should do is say no. So stand up and say like, no, we're just not going to be able to do this. Sorry. There's a reason why sustainable pace is an important idea in Agile, while there's Agile development teams, as I said earlier, are empowered or should be empowered. And sometimes, if you feel that empowerment isn't there or isn't granted to you, you have to grab it, you have to take it, and you have to be courageous and say like, no, this is just, we've done this too many times. There's no point continuing this in the future. But again, easier said than done, I admit that.
Yeah, I think we should try. Thank you for that.
Good luck.
Great. Generally, Roman, feel free to say no whenever we're out of time and you've had enough with the questions. Otherwise, there's so many. Do you have time for one or two more?
Yeah, go for it.
Awesome. Okay, so the next one is from Andrew. Andrew Lisbeth, would you like to ask your question? Cool, I will ask it for you. How would you suggest dealing with a stakeholder who's actually the business owner that is constantly micromanaging the product and complaining about the speed of development?
Yeah, good question. So if a business owner, and so I don't know if that's a business owner in the safe sense, but somebody who is responsible ultimately then for the commercial side of a product, tries to step in and micromanage the team, or in a way take away responsibility from the product owner or the product people and the development team, then it's going to be very interesting for me to find out why that is. So I've seen people do that. I've seen business owners do that in a situation of crises, where they felt they now really have to turn things around, and this product is going so badly and the current development effort is going so badly that they felt they had no choice than to step in. So if there's a crisis situation, then that might motivate the individual's behavior. If there is no crisis, then is there a lack of trust? So that would be something to explore and see, if the product owner doesn't trust the product manager, product owner, and doesn't trust and understands the level of empowerment and respect that the development team deserves. And again, the only way for you to find out is try and engage with the individual, and engage again in an understanding, empathic, warm-hearted way, and explore, find out what's going on here. What's the root cause here. And I think once again, similar to other questions I've been asked, once you understand that root cause, the right strategy to address it, should hopefully become apparent.
Great. Andrew has replied, great, thanks for the advice. Shall we have one or two more? The next one is from Johan, who I believe is all the way in South America. Johan, would you like to ask your question? Cool, I will ask for you. So the question is, how can you rebuild trust in a digital transformation program or project when the stakeholders they want to change to waterfall or another approach because they feel uncomfortable with agile ways of working?
Yeah, nice question. So I've participated, I've experienced a number of agile transformations that didn't work out in the long run, that had some initial successes, and then the organization fell back into the old ways of working and ended up with a weird hybrid of waterfall dominated practices, and particularly management approaches, and then some agile practices. I think in those situations, it's really important to try and objectively look at what happened and try and understand what happened. And I think a good way to do this is to listen to people and gather their perspectives and see what are the perceptions of the different individuals involved. And so it might be that the stakeholders have very different perceptions from the development team members. The development team members might feel that actually everything was going well, and this was a pretty well-functioning development team, and that the process was okay, and what's the big deal? And for the stakeholders, they might have thought like this was horrible and chaotic, and they were missing the plans and the sort of level of commitment up front that they were used to. So it'd be interesting to find out what happened, and what is people's take on what happened, and why do people evaluate it in a certain way, and then what was the goal of the agile transformation, and has that goal been achieved, or have you been able to move closer to that goal? And if that goal hasn't been achieved, is it still valid? Well, if that goal is still valid, then what would be the best way, given the experiences you have, to make progress towards that goal? So that's another thing that I think I've encountered more than once, that an agile transformation didn't have a clear goal. And if you don't have a clear goal, if you say, well, we have to be agile because agile is good and everybody's agile now, and digital means agile, and therefore we have to do Scrum, or we have to do X, Y, Z, then that can be too weak in order to sustain the effort of that a major change program requires. So I don't know if that was any good.
No, it makes sense to me. I'm not sure if Johan is on to clarify though, so but I think that was great. Thank you. Shall we have one more question?
Last question. Yes. Yeah.
Last question. Hopefully it's a good one. Dewi Rees, are you on to ask your question? Cool. I love asking questions anyway. So she wanted to firstly thank you for the talk, Roman. So thank you on behalf of her. The question is, how would you deal with these types of situations where you are in a very small team and conflict may possibly cause bad feelings or break down relationships in the team? This is with a team that's a small startup of 5 or less people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nice question. So one of the things that often happens with conflict, and I've seen this at work quite a lot, but I've witnessed it, with friends and family members as well, is that a conflict is suppressed. So there is dispute, there is disagreement, there is friction, there may be some bad feelings, but it's kind of suppressed. It's like, oh, it's too sticky. We don't really want to deal with it now, or it seems too difficult to be dealt with. And as I said earlier, what tends to happen is that this conflict doesn't go away. You may sort of forget about it, but it's still there in the background. It still lingers. And if something similar happens, it just erupts. And usually over time, then, what triggers that conflict makes the conflict and makes the bad feeling that it brings up worse and worse and worse. And so, again, that's why, at least in theory, I would say, don't suppress conflict, don't ignore it, but try and address it in the right way. Now, I know myself that it's not always easy to address conflict. Was it yesterday morning, day before yesterday? Somebody sent out an email saying, we're now going to do this as a team. And I had to say, no, that's not going to happen. And it's just lots of wishful thinking. And so, and I thought, like, oh my God, how can you do this? How can the individual just send out this email? And so, we had an email conversation, but we haven't really addressed the conflict. And I'm still thinking about what is the best way to deal with this, and what is a response from my end that is kind and compassionate and just doesn't kind of retaliate or put her in her place, or show her that I know more, or that her behavior was wrong and my behavior is better. Because, then it's always about win and lose. And if there's win and lose, then the conflict doesn't get constructively resolved. It doesn't get truly resolved. So what I'm trying to say is, it's not always easy to find the right approach to start resolving the conflict, but ultimately it is about engaging in a conversation. And so a model I mentioned earlier, which I'm quite fond of, is nonviolent communication. And nonviolent communication suggests that, again, you engage in a conversation, you engage in a dialogue, but it means that both individuals who participate in the conflict are willing to do that. And then you share your perceptions, and then you share how the situation was and is for you, what feelings were and are present. And then you talk about what are your underlying needs, why is that so important for you? Why is the issue so important for you? And what would help you? What is a request that you'd like to make? What would you like the other person ask to do? And that can be a great process in order to reach a sustainable agreement, or to actually address the conflict and its root causes. Now, when you're in a startup environment and you have conflict between people, then again, the conflict is unlikely to go away. As a startup, you want to grow, so you need to be able to work together in a productive and collaborative way. And so I think you don't really have a choice other than addressing the conflict. Of course, there's another option, and that is one of the people involved in the conflict, may decide to leave. And again, a friend of mine who works for a startup, few more, something he's a little bit bigger, so about sort of 20 to 30 people, if I remember correctly, and he's been in conflict with another senior person. And he's raised the issue to his boss. He's tried to resolve it, and nothing's helped. And he's seriously considering to leave. So, that's sort of the thing with conflicts. If they linger, and if they're painful enough, and you can't address them, or you can't find ways to address them, then sometimes, unfortunately, it means that the company loses people and loses good people.
Great. Thank you very much for the question and the answer. Well, I think that's all we have time for, guys. We've had about 20-25 minutes of questions. Again, a very big thank you to Roman for the talk and the questions afterwards. It's been very insightful.